I'm joined today by Rachel Sherman, who's an associate professor of sociology at the New School in New York, also author of the new book, Uneasy Street, The Anxieties of Affluence. I just finished the book, Rachel. Very, very interesting. The concept is you interview a number of wealthy families, all in New York City. How did the project start? How did you think to do this?
Well, it came out of an earlier project that I had done on luxury hotels, actually, where part of that project involved interviewing people who stayed at luxury hotels. And I felt like they were a little bit conflicted about sort of their entitlement or their right to stay in those kinds of places and very concerned about how they should behave there. And that got me thinking about their lifestyle choices and kind of how they felt about those choices. And I also did some research on the lifestyle management industry, also known as the personal concierge industry, in which I found, I was a little bit behind the scenes on wealthy people's consumption. So I just wanted to talk to people about, people who had some extra money, basically who had some flexibility in how they spent money, about how they made those decisions.
So you don't identify the people that you talk to in the book, but you sort of talk about their marital situation, family situation, net worth, et cetera, and sort of describe them qualitatively in that way. Was it even telling people that you weren't going to identify them personally? Was it difficult to get wealthy couples to talk to you and to tell you about their spending and their finances?
Yeah, I mean, mostly I did not interview couples, just to clarify, mostly interviewed people individually. And in the few cases where I did interview couples, it was only, I think, in two cases did I interview them together. But
Right. So to be clear, what you interviewed people who were in relationships, but you would only interview people individually. Is that more fair?
yeah, I mean, it doesn't really matter that much. But yeah, I did interview a couple of couples together, which is enlightening in a different way. And I should also point out that I only interviewed parents, people who were, I think they were all married, my subjects. Some of them are gay and lesbian, but they're all parents and they're all coupled. So, yeah, I mean, partly because when I went into this project, I really was thinking about it as a kind of study of big consumption decisions, right? Like the kinds of, where you're going to send your kid to school, where you're going to buy a house, how you're going to renovate your house, what you do with your leisure time. So I went in thinking about that and having framing the project as being around lifestyle choices. And then it just became clear over the course of the project that it was really difficult for people to talk about money in general, and people have different ways of dealing with it. Certainly, some of them did not want to talk to me very explicitly about it, although ultimately I think they did. And you brought up the question of confidentiality. Even with that promise of anonymity and confidentiality, it was still, sometimes people were not as free as you might imagine that they would be about specific, but particularly about their assets and specific numbers.
One of the fascinating things I found from reading the book is the way in which you would see, sort of based on the politics of the individuals, how they sort of differently described their relationship to the money that they had. And sometimes it was money that was acquired through inheritance. Sometimes it's money that's acquired through their or their significant others' work. In other words, sort of like earned wages, I guess we would call them. And the way that these individuals sort of related to wealth and also to the rest of society did seem to differ based on what their sort of political predispositions were. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I think it's complicated to think about. There are definitely differences among these people and how they relate to their wealth. It's a little bit complicated to map those with any degree of confidence. So, more progressive people were more likely to feel a little bit more conflicted, or at least to talk to me about those conflicts. But the more progressive people in my sample also tended to be the people who had inherited wealth. And inherited wealth people, in general, may be more conflicted regardless of their politics. So I think both of those things kind of combine to produce the more liberal guilt that we're kind of familiar with, and it has to do also with their relationship to earning money, as you said. It's interesting. I got an email a few days ago from someone who had read the New York Times piece who said, "Why do you use the word earn? Right? Why do we talk about these people as earners, which sort of inherently makes it seem like they deserve the money more?" And that's something that, why not say that they are paid? Because earn has this kind of moral meaning inherent in it, which is something that a lot of my respondents were kind of, trying to bring themselves closer symbolically to earning money, even if they weren't actually earning money.
So you describe the presence of this sort of liberal guilt around wealth for more of the progressive oriented people that you interviewed in terms of their actions, in terms of whether it's spending on luxuries or charitable donations. If you had the liberal guilt, were you more likely, based on the people you spoke to maybe donate more money to charity or to think differently about lavish spending on luxuries?
Yeah, again, it's hard to say because a lot of the people that I interviewed had inherited wealth, but they also had earned wealth. So, they don't think of themselves, they don't talk about themselves as inheritors the way that people who have inherited wealth but don't also earn significant amounts of money because they work in academia or the arts or nonprofits or something like that do. Um, so it's really complicated to make these kinds of distinctions. But in the main, I think that the people who gave away the most money on the inheritor side, probably across the board, the people who gave away the most money were the people who had the most money. There also I interviewed several earners who, had assets of over $50 million or $20 million, and they gave away pretty substantial amounts of money too. Um, yeah, but the progressive, specifically the kind of progressive inheritors, do see that as a really strong political obligation. And the other thing I wanted to say about them is that one of the things that I think differentiates people who are more conflicted and think about these kinds of issues more from those who don't is what their social networks are like. So people who have more liberal politics and who have more or who have more kind of creative class jobs where you don't earn a lot of money, tend to have more heterogeneous social networks, right? They come into contact with more different kinds of people. And they think, because of their politics, I think they think differently about people who have less than they do. They kind of imagine those people occupy a bigger place in their imagination. So that's another reason that people in those categories were more likely to express conflict about it. And some of these progressive inheritors, were actually better at talking about their conflict because many of them had been in therapy to talk about them. They've been in progressive environments where wealthy people are a little bit more open about, they've gone through a process which they sometimes call coming out about having wealth and being able to talk about it more.
I've used this term before on my program, hedonic adaptation, which is the idea that as you obtain more wealth, you become accustomed to your sort of standard of living, and that becomes your new baseline. And over the long term, it doesn't really provide more happiness than you might have had at a previous level of wealth. And I noticed in reading some of the interviews that you did with people, the ones that you describe as upward oriented, in other words, they're sort of comparing their situation to that of even wealthier people. That was very interesting to me because particularly when you're already wealthy and you're comparing your wealth to that of even wealthier people, you're really comparing yourself to an even smaller group, right? I mean, presumably for the most part, the more money you have, you're part of a smaller and smaller percentage of the population. Did you find that in the interviews you did, you got the sense that there was like a totally being acclimatized to this standard of living as a reasonable and normal baseline?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's almost two different questions there. One is that, yes, I think across the board, whether they're, sort of upward oriented or downward oriented, people do get used to it. And this is something a woman whom I quote in the book talked about as luxury creep, right? She's like, suddenly we spend more on a bottle of wine, we spend more on clothes. These, instead of $10, it's $20 or $30 on a bottle of wine without even really noticing it. And that's partly because that's something that all of their peers are doing, right? And I think that there's also a process of people in this life stage, people with small children mostly, who are sending them to school, who are often buying a place to live for the first time, where they're kind of consolidating a particular kind of lifestyle. So for people who've been conflicted, especially inheritors who've been conflicted about having money, I think this is the point where they start putting that money to work, and then they get kind of used to it, and then what they're spending kind of ratchets up, just as a function of kind of who they're hanging out with. As I said before, I think the more diverse their networks are, the more aware they are of that process. It doesn't necessarily mean that it doesn't happen, but I think they do have some awareness of it. Now, the thing about upward-oriented people, who are those people who who don't have such diverse social networks typically they're upward oriented in the sense that they're thinking of people above them, or they're thinking of people who are like them, but they're not thinking of people who are kind of below them. And exactly, I think the implication of what you said is my argument, which is that as they look up, they fail to look down, even though these people are in the top 2, 1, some of them 0.1%. And so they use that looking up actually as a way of establishing themselves as in the middle. They want to feel like they're in the middle sort of symbolically. I mean, they know that they're not in the middle distributionally,
Yeah, it
but
reminds me of the Trump comment. I started with really just a small loan of $1 million from my dad.
right, exactly.
It's
Yeah, and I mean, I think some of them might recognize a little bit more than Trump tends to, the ways that they've gotten ahead. I had very few people who would really strongly assert that they had made it all on their own. And even people who did do that would like sort of on the side mention that, well, I had some help from my in-laws or something like that. They kind of don't want to recognize that. But most people are, even the people who are very highly paid in jobs in finance and so on, would talk about being lucky or having had particular kinds of opportunities as well.
We are speaking with Professor Rachel Sherman about her new book, Uneasy Street, The Anxieties of Affluence. We'll pause here and continue our conversation with her. We're continuing our conversation with Rachel Sherman, who's Associate Professor of Sociology at the New School in New York, also author of the book Uneasy Street, The Anxieties of Affluence. Rachel, at the end of the first part, we were talking about sort of the way in which the wealthy individuals you interviewed seemed sort of adapted to their standard of living as a new baseline. Did you sort of experience that yourself? Because there's a point in the book where you write about sort of you were adapting and sympathizing with and having compassion for the difficulties of managing the renovations of 3 properties that someone might have, including one in the Hamptons or whatever. Did you start to sort of see the world through the types of problems that really rich people have as well?
Yeah, I mean, I think that example comes up particularly because the women that I had spoken to when I started feeling like that had, yeah, I would say, relatively significant problems with their husbands around the control of money. And I just felt very sympathetic to the lack of recognition that they were getting from their husbands. And then I felt like it was distracting me from the fact that the problems that they were talking about had to do with the renovation of the home in the Hamptons or whatever. But the broader issue, I mean, in general, I found it very difficult to retain some level of objectivity, right? We're so used to judging wealthy people and just thinking that their expenditures, are ridiculous or are reasonable or, that they're nice people or bad people or whatever. It's hard to kind of get out of that. But I think I had the advantage of being a relatively experienced, sociological interviewer. So I already know a little bit how to minimize that. But the being caught between the kind of common judgments that circulate about rich people, and to which I'm certainly not immune, and the empathy or the identification that interviewers often feel with the people that they're talking to was a little bit of a fine line to walk.
Yeah, well, in the interviews, you do ask questions that sort of try to get at, and really you have a whole chapter about this, how these wealthy people you spoke to, I don't know if defend is the right way, but I'm going to use that word, and then you can sort of correct me or point me in a better direction. Defend the wealth that they have from a sort of deserving it standpoint. And you would see a lot of different lines of reasoning that in the people you interviewed, right? Listen, we pay lots of taxes, so we're doing what we need to do. We pay the taxes on the money we make, and thus it's okay. Or listen, we still work in other ways. We take care of the kids and do a lot of volunteering or work wherever it is that has some kind of social good, etc. Talk to me a little bit about the defenses of wealth.
Yeah, I'm not sure I would. I mean, defenses is a reasonable word. I think justifications might be a better word,
Hmm.
although justification kind of has a connotation of insincerity, which I don't think that these people are insincere in talking about this. I think what they're doing is highlighting the content of the judgments that are very broadly made of wealthy people in American culture and possibly elsewhere. Of you deserve your wealth if you've worked hard for it, or a little bit if you still work hard, or if so if you are, as you said, like a stay-at-home mother, you're trying to frame yourself as working even though you're not working for pay. Or if you're an inheritor, you're trying to frame yourself as working in a job even though you know that you didn't actually earn the money that you're living on. But the idea of being a hard worker, whether or not that explains your money, and the idea of consuming not being an ostentatious, materialistic, greedy consumer. And then the idea of giving money back. Some people refer to their taxes, as you said. Many people refer to their charitable contributions or to volunteerism. A lot of people also talked about a kind of obligation to be aware of their privilege. So even though they sort of don't want to talk about it, they also feel like they need privately to recognize it. And they want to raise kids who are also sort of morally worthy, good people, and who themselves have all of these traits. So in those ways, they kind of draw these distinctions between people who are entitled, who are morally worthy of wealth, and people who are not.
So other than, I mean, you talked about the more progressive people that you spoke to tended to have more liberal guilt about their wealth, but sort of more putting aside the broader political identification, were there specific factors you found that made some wealthy people more attuned to issues of wealth inequality and the problems of the less wealthy and the poor than others, whether it's, they inherited money versus they earned it through work or investments or whatever else? What other factors might we point to?
Well, I think people, I mean, this is, again, it's kind of the opposite of the inheritor piece, but people who are actually upwardly mobile are more, they have family members and friends from their childhoods or, communities of origin who have much less than they do. So those people also tend to, keep others in their mind. And the people who have really a lot of wealth, they're not upwardly mobile in the traditional sense, and that many of them started middle class or upper middle class to begin with. But then if you have $50 million, you are upwardly mobile relative to what you started with. So they have a consciousness about that too. And I think a lot of these people they're not unaware that like poor people exist, right? I think they all know that. One of the things I think that happens in stereotypes of rich people is that we imagine that rich people are kind of incredibly stupid and shallow. I mean, these are very well-educated people who live in the world, so they know that people who have less than they do exist. It's just partly a question of how they manage that knowledge. And some of them take a much more kind of charitable approach, which says, we're never going to change this system. It's not my job to change the system. I'm entitled to this because I work hard and I'm a nice person and I'm a reasonable parent. So I'm going to give some money away and, I'm not going to be that conflicted about it. Those people still feel the need that I was just talking about to be morally worthy, right? They still don't want to show off their money. They don't want to hoard their money. They don't want their kids to be obnoxious or entitled, right? The concept of entitlement is something that across the board, my respondents really didn't like. But the way that they sort of see those obligations does vary.
It's interesting that you talk about, these are not stupid people or ignorant people. They're well educated. I'm curious to hear your thoughts about, there's been a lot of different studies about how wealth can sort of change one's perception of reality. There's studies about the reduction of compassion on average of wealthier people. There's this UC Berkeley study, which showed that there will be sort of a rationalization of advantage by convincing oneself that they deserve it. And you explore that in the book with this idea of, hey, I worked hard, etc. Studies that show even sort of mundane things like richer people are more likely to ignore pedestrians, or there's a UCSF study about the wealthier you are, the worse you are on average at reading the facial expressions of others, this type of thing. What's your thought after doing all the research and interviews for your book about all of that research that's out there?
Yeah, and a lot of that research relies on social psychological methods, sort of experimental methods that take place in laboratories. And I think those kinds of methods, sometimes just get at something different than what I'm looking at. And I think that we have so little research on rich people. It may be, one explanation would be like there's different kinds of rich people, and some of them, have all of the traits, the sort of negative traits that have been identified in these primarily social psychological studies. And some of them have, a stronger moral compass of the kind that I'm identifying or whatever. But I also just think that these are different aspects of having the experience of having privilege. So, talking explicitly with me about some of these issues is going to be different from how people are going to be in a lab, although it does matter which people are in the lab, which is another part of this. Um, and I think what's important is to just keep exploring these differences and these kind of characteristics, because I don't think that they're necessarily mutually exclusive, right? And the point that I'm trying to emphasize is not so much like rich people are moral, right? That, they're not as evil as we think that they are. My point is more about thinking, well, why are we invested in judging them as moral or not moral? And what are the criteria that we're using to do that? So do we really think that in a society with the levels of inequality that we are currently seeing, that it is okay to be, to have $10 million or $50 million or $50 billion, just, on the basis of being a nice person or having worked hard or, not living in a McMansion, right? And these are the criteria that my respondents are laying out. And they are also criteria that I think resonate with people who aren't rich, or certainly aren't as rich as they are.
Do you know how many of the people you interviewed have read the book, and is anybody upset about how they were portrayed?
I don't know, and I don't know. I do care, and I would be interested to know. I mean, again, I have really tried to not do what I think a lot of people might do in this kind of research, which is be really voyeuristic, or kind of talk a lot about their homes or the spending that they do have, and make the judgment myself that they are or are not reasonable consumers, right? That, for example, that's a totally relative category, and I just want to take myself out of making those judgments. I think that some of them may appreciate that I'm trying to understand and represent their perspective. But on the other hand, I have ended up talking about things that I think are hard for many of them to talk about. And yeah, that might be something that they don't like. I have gone very far out of my way to preserve their anonymity. So I hope that makes a difference too.
We've been speaking about the book Uneasy Street, The Anxieties of Affluence. We've been speaking with the book's author, Professor Rachel Sherman. Thanks so much for talking to me about it. I found the book super interesting.
Great. Thank you. Thanks for having me.